I'm Michael Gilligan. I'm the Chief Common Ground Officer for Seek Common Ground. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to be hearing from three project directors from our first ARPA Action Accelerator on what they learned the hard way. They'll be talking about their experiences of managing projects and their exposure to one another and to you all through the Seek Common Ground learning community. So we're being joined today by Rachel Belin. She's the managing partner and co-founder of the Kentucky Student Voice Team. Shirley Brandman, an advisor to the Black and Brown Coalition for Educational Equity and Excellence, and they are in Montgomery County, Maryland, and Morgan Craven, who's the National Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Community Engagement at the Intercultural Development Research Association, and they're located in San Antonio, Texas. As they discuss their projects, they're going to be sharing some context around the specific activity that they conducted through our first ARPA Action Accelerator, and also their exposure to Seek Common Ground through actually multiple action accelerators. As we go along, we invite you to submit questions in the Q&A function on Zoom. If we don't get to them during the first half hour of today's session, we'll refer to them during overtime, the unrecorded second half hour of our talk. Speaking of which, we're now referring to this concept of talks as an hour. Previously, we referred to them as a half hour because that's the recorded session. And then we went to overtime, which is the more informal, unrecorded session. For those of you who are joining us live, we really encourage you to stay on to engage in the unvarnished discussion during the second half hour. And the first half hour will be available afterwards to folks for reference on Slack and also on YouTube. And so for those of you who are not joining us live. In addition, we have an upcoming talk. We're going to be speaking with Landon Mascareñas from the Colorado Education Initiative on the open system on December 1st, and that will be at noon Eastern Standard Time. In addition, we schedule learning community engagements based on your suggestions. So don't be shy about posting on Slack recommendations for talks, also for small group discussions, and even for one-on-one sessions with your peers or with the Seek Common Ground team. So now I'm going to stop talking and I'm going to turn it over to our panelists, and I would like them to each give you a little bit more of an introduction of themselves and talk about their work, and then we'll get to the panel discussion. So I'll turn to you first, Rachel, to introduce yourself.
Hey, thank you, Michael, and hello, everybody. My name is Rachel Belin, and I bet you can guess what I represent by the student design graphic behind me. I'm the managing partner of the Kentucky Student Voice Team. This is a statewide, independent, youth-led organization that's committed to co-creating more just and democratic Kentucky schools and communities by supporting students as education, research, policy, and advocacy partners. I'm actually speaking today for a high school senior who managed our ARPA project, Connor Flick. He is in school, and it is before Thanksgiving, and he's doing college apps and exams. So I will try to do my best to fill in for him, but he really managed this entire project with a team of other high school students. More specifically, though, I'm representing a youth-led initiative that was designed to build on some of our existing participatory action research, youth-led participatory action research around school climate and the impacts of COVID-19 on learning from home, And the work was all about what we are always all about, engaging young people in policy conversations that are relevant to their lives. A key deliverable for us as part of this process was a toolkit to support adults, families, and other students to engage other students in these conversations. We have a lot of other deliverables that still continue to pour out well beyond the accelerator limit, but that was one of them. And I'm excited for you to hear about my co-panelists. So I'll popcorn.
Thanks, Rachel. Over to you, Morgan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Morgan Craven. I'm the National Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Community Engagement at IDRA. We are a nonprofit that is based in Texas, but we do work across the US South. And we really focus on the ways that we can use research and educator training and policy advocacy and community engagement to promote excellent and equitable schools for all students, particularly students of color and emergent bilingual, also known as English learner students. I really work on our policy advocacy and community engagement side. And in addition to the sort of substantive policy areas that we work on, like access to fair and equitable funding and how we build culturally sustaining schools, we really focus on how we do our work. And similar to what Rachel was describing, we really believe that the people who are most impacted by education policies, students and families, need to be involved in shaping those policies, both in their communities at the local level, but also state level education policy. So a lot of our work is focused on strengthening community engagement between organizations and schools, but also students and families and others with, the statewide policy making processes. And so our project was focused on really tapping into the community engagement networks that we have built with students and families, and having listening and learning sessions where we essentially explained ARPA funds, the use of funds, the allowable uses of the funds, and encouraged folks to think about ways that the funds can be used to address systemic inequities that they had been seeing in their schools for a really long time, but that of course had been heightened and made worse by COVID-19. So our project was really an extension of a lot of the community engagement and policy and advocacy work that we were doing, with a particular focus on thinking deeply about the ways that the funds could be used. And I will pass it to Shirley.
Thanks so much. Hi, everyone. Great to be with you this afternoon. My name is Shirley Brandman. I have the honor of being a strategic advisor to the Black and Brown Coalition for Educational Equity and Excellence. As Michael said, we're based in Montgomery County, Maryland. For those of you who are not familiar, we are a very large school district, over 160,000 students. And this was the first time really that advocates in the Black and Brown community through our NAACP Parent Council and a trusted local nonprofit that serves Latino youth tried to bring together advocates, so that since we have a school district where 54% of the student body are Black and Brown, trying to leverage the power of these two communities to come together in advocacy. That was the initial design of the coalition. We kicked off in October of 2019. COVID definitely threw us for a loop, but we are working hard to try to bring the voices together for communities that traditionally advocated competitively, to have them now advocate collaboratively. What I bring to the coalition is I served on the Montgomery County Board of Education for many years, so I am trying to be a value add in helping to understand how to try to shape practices, policies, and the work of the system. We have developed a series of advocacy asks. One of them is around culturally and linguistically appropriate engagement of traditionally underserved students and families. And our focus has been on how the school system can really, through their communication and their outreach and engagement, bring the student voice and family voice of those who have the greatest need into their decision making. So for us, this accelerator allowed us to partner with a researcher at the University of Maryland. And what we wanted to do was to talk directly to parents who often felt like they did not have a way in, could not be heard, to ask them about what were the barriers, and also to talk to them coming through COVID about what they saw their students needing and what the students themselves said they needed to recover, so that decision-making around the allocation of the federal funding would be driven by the needs as spoken to and as identified by the students and families. So that was our project, and we were thrilled to be in the learning community.
Thank you all for your introductions. And as you all in the audience can hear, these are some really fascinating bodies of work that people have engaged in. Let's stick with you, Shirley, and just go right to that question. What did you learn from this project work? What did you learn the hard way about executing a project through the Common Ground Action Accelerator?
So one of the things we had greatly underestimated was how hard it was going to be, candidly, to connect again with students and families kind of coming through the pandemic. So we have lots of deep grassroots connections, both in the Black and the Brown community. But when we tried to work with this researcher to have these focus groups to really talk to people about where they saw their needs, we really found that a lot of families just wanted to pull back. They didn't want to participate. They just needed a break over the summer, which was the timing of this accelerator project. And it made it a lot harder for us to get participation, even from families who trusted the organizations that were inviting in, who trusted the researchers who were working with us, who had credible connections. That was sort of our first stumbling block, is that in this emerging recovery world where people are still very much trying to heal internally, the connections, whether they were virtual to make them easier, which was what we tried to do, it proved a more difficult scenario. So we did not get as much participation as we had hoped in terms of forming the basis of some of the conclusions. It did for us just, however, reinforce the point that when you really want to think about culturally and linguistically appropriate outreach, and you really want to make sure that those students with the greatest need are helping to shape the recovery, that some of the timeframes and some of the timelines meeting the state and federal requirements just weren't working, and there needs to be a lot more happening and going on. We also, for us, as I described, one of the ways in which the coalition is really trying to bring the Black and the Brown communities together, we also just sort of had to acknowledge that sometimes because of language barriers and sometimes because the impact in our county of COVID was different. The Latino community was uniquely ravaged in Montgomery County by COVID, that outreach to them had to be very separate. So even though we're very focused on the coming together of the collective, the outreach had to be very much more sensitive and very different and unique, and almost on parallel tracks that could then be aligned together at the end. So I will stop there. I think that may prompt some questions later, but I want to let my colleagues jump in.
Well, I suspect what you just shared with us, Shirley, resonates with everyone who's conducted work over the past several months. And so now let's go to you, Morgan, with the same question. What did you learn through this project? What did you learn the hard way in executing a Action Accelerator project?
Yeah, we had the same challenges that Shirley was just describing. The timing of it, summertime, finding appropriate times for people to meet, to come together for our listening and learning sessions, and really making sure the process was accessible for other people was what we found to be most difficult. And I agree on the lessons learned, particularly what Shirley pointed out about, if we're all going through this process, and this is a process that states and local education agencies are supposed to be going through themselves, how are they doing this effectively when the rest of us who have built up these networks over time are struggling to do it? The answer is they are not. So I think the other lesson that we learned, though, was that while sometimes it feels like breadth is the thing that you should be going for in terms of like accessing lots of people and getting the word out about the ARPA funds, which I do think is certainly really important. Everyone should know about this. Everyone should be able to weigh in on what happens in their communities with these funds. It's also really important to take the time and go deep with people. And that is one of the valuable things that we got out of having smaller listening and learning sessions. So one thing I shared when our project was ending is that we would get RSVPs for our sessions where it was like 80 people are going to join us on a Thursday evening, and I would get so excited, and then it would turn out to be like around 20, 25 people. But that was really, really valuable because we were able to dig in with those people and go a little bit deeper. You know, we had the idea that we would do breakout sessions and everyone would get to participate in that way. But it was really, really wonderful just to have a more focused group. Our listening and learning sessions were divided sort of by community. So we were sharing the same information and trying to sort of get the same type of feedback about how funds should be used. But we focused one session on Black students in particular. We focused one session on emergent bilingual students and families in particular. We focused one session on students and their feedback. So being able to sort of dig in and see the value of maybe not being able to get 80 people every time, but having those 20 that you have the time to just sort of collaborate with each other and, you know, elaborate on ideas was really, really valuable. So while it was, you know, certainly a hard lesson to realize, like we couldn't get exactly what we initially envisioned in terms of participation, we were certainly able to see how valuable it was to have a smaller group of folks to really dig in and focus with.
Thank you, Morgan. Just so it resonates so strongly that the difficulty that you had and Shirley as well in terms of engaging community, that it likely is lip service paid from our institutional friends at state education agencies, even local education agencies. And it resonates strongly that, you know, sacrificing some breadth in order to go deeper with people, that is the seek common ground way. That is a really great reminder to us that we want to deeply engage with people. And if that means that we have to focus, that's okay. So, Rachel, bring us home. That same question. What did you learn through this work that you'd like to share with the audience?
I love that Shirley and Morgan talk first, because I really want to build on what they both said. Was so essential. The idea that, you know, trying to build up your grassroots momentum when there's been a real stop just globally with the pandemic, but also summer is always a challenge. And then Morgan, what you're saying about discovering, you know, the depth over breadth equation during all this too. Both of those really, really resonate with me. I'm going to add one more layer for our work, which was because some in our audience know that the Kentucky Student Voice Team moved to an independent youth-led organization after 8 years this year as part of a parent organization. And so we are really testing the limits of youth agency and all of this at the same time as we're doing the accelerator. So as I mentioned in the beginning, we had a high school student leading this work with other high school students, and that we try to bring support young people in the earliest phases of the design of everything we do. And that includes everything from programming to budgeting and evaluation. So the other challenge for me, or what I learned the hard way, or what I'm learning the hard way, is just the degree to which youth-led requires adult support. And it's not only different for every single student that I work with, it changes day to day because students are growing at such rapid paces. So that's a whole nother layer that I'm really learning about. And the accelerator, because of the time frame, the artificially imposed 3-month time construct makes you really face that very quickly. But at the same time, that's what we love about our accelerators. The learning process is very accelerated too. So I just want to build on exactly what Shirley and Morgan were saying. Those are some of the exact same challenges we faced, and I love what you were deriving from that and distilling, Morgan, about, okay, if it's this hard for us, we're out there every single day doing this work. Come on, how are government agencies actually getting real feedback on ARPA? So those are just a few things I learned the hard way. And those are just a few things until now that I've learned the hard way. And with that, I'll pop it over to you, Shirley, because now we get to, I think, Michael, we get to cut you out as a middleman and have a conversation. It gets real now.
I think I might get to ask the first question, right?
Go for it.
I have a question for Rachel, building off of what you just said in terms of working specifically with young people. I watched the Kentucky Student Voice Team sort of wrap up video from your project, which, if all of you listening have not yet watched it, it's really fascinating and interesting. So Connor said something, Connor, the student who was the project lead, that sort of led to a question for me. So part of this project was certainly like getting recommendations for from young people on how to use the funds, but he reminded me that a significant portion of it for you all was probably educating students about the funds themselves, how they can be used, how to think about the use of funds and sort of making policy recommendations. So can you talk a little bit about how you balance sort of what I think of as a first phase of educating young people and sort of translating all of this and making this accessible for them, to then transitioning to them being the ones who then make policy recommendations? What was that process like?
Oh, that's a great question. Thank you. That was the big find of the first phase of the project, that not only did we need to educate ourselves as an intergenerational team, but we needed to be able to educate ourselves to a point where we could distill it for others, and not only other students who are high-flying students, but students who are least heard on policy issues and need to be most heard on issues involving ARPA funding specifically. So that was a challenge, and it remains a challenge. And we see this work in the 3-month period of the accelerator as the very beginning. I mean, Michael's not going to like that I say this, but it's, every time, this is our 3rd accelerator, and we produce deliverables during the 3-month period, but they always way transcend the 3 months, and we're still working around pieces and materials that have come out of the first 2 accelerators many months ago, one even a year ago, because it sparks a lot in our team, and the learning curve is very, very steep for us. So it always takes us longer to like front load our understanding of what we need to be doing before we act and produce. And actually, I would recommend that as a good, at least it works for us, a good practice in general is even in the 3-month time period, like going deep on the front loading of planning, especially if you're bringing in families and young people into the design process. Taking the time to do that before action has been really helpful for us. I'm guessing it probably was similar for you all, Morgan and Shirley, but I don't know.
Such a good point.
Yeah,
such a good point, Rachel. So Morgan, I wanted to pick up on something that you said before, as you were talking about, the transition. You didn't have the breadth, but you were able to go into some smaller groups, but some of them were, like groups. So you might have had Black students together, or you might have had other students together. And I'm curious, the one thing that I struggle with is how we then break down that sense of isolation between some of these pockets of the community. Because I know, honestly, participating in the accelerator, one of the beauties of it is you break out of this is just us doing this. You try to see other people in the space. And I think a lot about how do we even do that within our communities. And we think about it a lot in Black and Brown. So I'm curious on your reflections.
Yeah, it's a good question. So one thing, IDRA co-convenes a statewide education policy coalition in Texas that is made up of all sorts of groups, cross-sector coalition, cross groups that focus on Black communities, groups that focus on Latino communities. And so part of our regular engagement is through that coalition and through a network of sort of partnerships that we call education cafes. And so we have, as part of our general work, opportunities where we are bringing folks together and talking about these issues. Because we sort of have that as a base of the way we typically do our work, we sort of thought it would be appropriate to have more of a focus through our listening and learning sessions. And I personally think that's important, because I think like sometimes when we talk about education equity issues, or we talk about like young people of color, there's a grouping that happens that is both helpful in some senses, but it's also not helpful if we think about the fact that each of those groups is experiencing these things slightly differently. So there are particular issues that Black students face. There are particular issues that emergent bilingual students face. And so having those groups think about those specific communities in this space was really important to us. And I think that because we have those larger coalitions generally, that's why it felt okay to, balance things in that way, if that makes sense.
Ask you a quick follow-up, Morgan. So then did you, in the cafes or later, share perspectives along the way? So is what you learned, let's say from the Black students, shared with others somewhere along the way?
Yes. So our coalition spaces are used to sort of discuss the larger sort of outcomes and recommendations. And that was actually happening before our accelerator project started. All of us were getting together and going, what's happening with funds and how can, that's literally how I did.
I gotcha. Yeah.
What's happening? Particularly because for our work here in Texas, our legislature was trying to get involved very heavily in the use of the funds, which was very concerning. So even before sort of our state accepted its ARPA funds, that was a whole ordeal. There were conversations going on in our coalition about how we could, weigh in and sort of influence how the state and schools were using the funds.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And I have a question for you, Shirley, kind of along those lines. And I would recommend to everybody, please watch Morgan and Shirley's video. They're awesome. But Shirley, in that video, you said something, about, asking families what they need versus telling them. That's sort of a guiding principle for you. And yet I know, because you're so candid about some of the challenges of doing that work in this process, can you speak more to, this dilemma that I think we all share, which is how do you engage stakeholders like the families you work with in identifying solutions when you're targeting the very families who have the most barriers in this work? What are some strategies that did work for you really well? And maybe you can also share what were the disaster strategies? What do we need to all avoid?
There's really good questions. So we've thought a lot about, particularly coming out of COVID, those non-educational partners who are very low to the ground and who are touching families. So people who do food distribution, right? Coming through COVID when there was so much food insecurity, people who do housing support, who are working with our traditionally underserved families in the education space, who were also very vulnerable on the eviction front, our faith-based partners. So we were connecting with others to bring us into spaces and to sort of piggyback as they were delivering food, to start asking a few questions about, is your Chromebook working? Do you understand about the registration? Has somebody talked to you about coming back to school? Do you know what the options are? So we were thinking about expanding our reach by going outside of our traditional education space, particularly in the recovery. I think that, the challenge for us, the disaster was when you try to work with a researcher and you're trying to sort of fill slots, it was hard because it was everybody's time that was sort of at stake. And so we need to really think differently and better about traditional tools for trying to ask our families kind of untraditional questions. But we've taken the lesson, and it's one, frankly, that we're trying to urge the school system to as well. And I think this came up in both what you, Rachel, and Morgan were saying. There are no shortcuts to the time to build trusting, deep relationships. And you're going to do it with fewer rather than more. Our school district did all of these pop-ups in the community, and they took credit for the fact that they walked out of their threshold and they were in communities giving out information, but it was still very one way. And we are really thinking about who in the school system, who in our coalition has the time and the capacity to slow it down, to be there consistently, to build those trusting relationships, because that's what it's really going to take to do all this work very differently. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I took notes.
Hear anyone else?
And I am going to jump back in and thank each of you for sharing your reflections. 3 different contexts, 3 different regions, a lot of shared experience and a lot of shared reflections, similar reflections. So thank you for sharing them. This concludes the recorded portion of the talk, and we will move over to the overtime discussion, where those of you in the audience will bring you up as panelists so that we can have a shared discussion and continue talking with our panelists. Again, let me reiterate, please let us know about what you would like for programming, specifically around upcoming talks, small group discussions, one-on-one sessions, and we will also see you on December 1st at noon Eastern time for our talk with Landon Mascarenhas.